Hello, folks out there in the world. This is David Rovix with another episode of Fifth Estate Live, and we are broadcasting currently on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. And if you're watching on one of those platforms, feel free to share the broadcast so you can tell other folks about it if they want to listen live, but you can also hear it in archived form in various locations, including at fifthestate.org, as well as in podcast form. If you look for This Week with David Rovix, wherever you get your podcasts, they all go up there as well. And I'm broadcasting here on these platforms generally most weekdays, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Fridays in one form or another at the same time, generally 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern. And it is on Tuesdays, Fifth Estate Live, produced by longtime Fifth Estate editorial board member Peter Werby, and who has a fantastic new novel out, by the way, Summer on Fire, a Detroit novel, absolutely amazing. I've been reading it, and it's a real page-turner, although when you have small children, even page-turners, you have to put them down. At least that's my experience. Don't know how other people do it, but and then the winter edition of Fifth Estate is the Anarchist Review of Books. It is out now, and the next edition of Fifth Estate will be coming in the future, and I don't know any details about that because it's the winter edition just came recently, and due to the Postal Service taking a very long time to mail things to anybody, it took a very long time to get to anybody. And today we are spending the hour, I'm very happy to say, with a science fiction writer and PhD student in Maine, originally from Washington State, Jess Flarity, who I've been reading all morning. And great to have you with us, Jess. Love your writing. And there's other, I have people on the show who I've known for decades, and then other people who I, only just heard of this morning, and you're in the latter category, and really enjoying your science fiction writing in the London Reader. Was it the London Reader was the publication? And having been reading what you've been writing about in terms of fiction and also in the Fifth Estate, the first question I guess that comes to mind is that to sort of get started with the discussion here is, what do sex, drugs, religion, and video games have in common?
Ooh, I love it. Thank you for having me. I just want to say I really appreciate the science fiction author on the ticker below. I'm like, oh, I finally made it. I'm an author.
So. Well, you're a published author, in fact. And I didn't even publish you. It was the London Reader. Very nice publication.
Yeah, it's very fancy. I'm very fortunate to get that. As one of my first big short story publications. So, sex, drugs, video games, rock and roll. It's all about, this just goes back to one of my favorite authors, Philip K. Dick, who really played on all those themes. And it's all about, I think, not only altered states of consciousness, but also getting that sense of like escape and entertainment, and also feeling like you're in a different world. They're all related to one another, and sometimes you can go a little overboard. Like, I think I don't know who said this, but I think it's the perfect quote with drugs, is that as long as you know exactly when the drugs stop being fun, then the drugs can be very fun. But as soon as you're not able to tell if you're enjoying it or not anymore, then it's obviously something that you don't have control over. And whether that means you're smoking weed as soon as you wake up, or you're logging onto your very addictive phone game and dropping hundreds of dollars on it. And I know people who do both. And I think, are you sure are you the one who's like, are you still enjoying this? Are you still getting that entertainment value, or is it just addiction? So,
yeah, and it's how much is the technology the problem, and how much is the economic system the problem, capitalism? I guess to get specific about your most recent piece in Fifth Estate, which was really about one of these particular aspects of these addictive technologies, or technologies that sort of have a basic statement in themselves in terms of what they're all about. I mean, like a video game you wrote about that is basically a male only environment, sort of by design, and then you talk about these sex robots, which are getting more sophisticated all the time. I don't know if they're not calling them robots yet, right? But they're these sex dolls, I guess they
Yeah,
call them dolls, right?
man.
Smart dolls. Eventually, they'll be calling them robots when they get to a certain point of sophistication. I suppose they'll have to be able to move around and stuff a lot more. I don't know, but the $6,000 sex doll is now a sort of an expensive item that is within the realm of affordability for a lot of people, guys out there, and it's becoming more and more part of our. Well, it's a societal phenomenon in this world, and there's so many troubling implications, and then so many questions around like, well, so okay, there's all these troubling implications, and then there's questions about what would be done, but what would the alternative be? What's the ideal? I mean, I don't. It's a big, complicated can of worms. It seems to me the whole question. And I know you're getting a PhD in feminist studies, I believe, so that makes a lot of that. There's a lot to study around these questions. But can you just kind of begin to unpack the complexity of this whole question of sex dolls that you're writing about, and the implications for society?
Yeah, I'll give it a college try here.
You're out of college after all.
Right, PhDs in literature, but I really like using
Literature.
feminist theory for looking at science fiction, especially because science fiction is kind of like a language, and then feminist theory is kind of like a language, and the two have a lot of sort of coded parts of them. And the sex robot, I was approached actually by a former mentor, Kara Hoffman, who's just a wonderful person, and she said,
Wonderful
"Hey,
person, editor of the current Anarchist Review of Books. The winter edition of the Fifth Estate is Kara. She's
yeah,
it's her baby. Hmm.
yeah," and she said, "Hey, Peter, wants an article about sex robots, and can you do that?" And I said, "Well, I guess so, because there is this intersection that happens specifically in like a feminized body, and then you turn into a robot, and so you've science fictionalized it, and now we've got this very complicated question of, is a sex robot healthier than a prostitute, and is it the same? Is it different?" And that really does matter. I was just doing some research earlier this morning, and I found a whole organization, and I'll have to switch over to them. I forget the name of it. Um, it's an entire society, the Campaign Against Sex Robots, and I was just reading through some of their statements, and I was like, yeah, I agree with a lot of this. If we start normalizing a real doll, right, and they are legal in the United States. They're not legal in other places around the world. But in 1968, there was this law that was passed that said you could send sex objects through the mail. And when that happened, it was like
What's that again?
there was I don't remember what the law was called, but in 1968 there was a law passed that said you could send sex objects through the mail in the United States, and that sort of created this. It was one of those kind of, it was a two-edged sword there in the 60s when we had this great revolution where we had this like freedom involved in the counterculture hippie movement, anarchist movement, where we're sort of attaching a lot of these chains about sex and these ideas we have about sex, but at the same time it was also commodified. And one of the good bad things about capitalism is that when there's a market, someone will exploit it. And if the person who's exploiting it says, well, if I didn't exploit it, then someone else will. And that's this guy at Abyss Creations, Matt McCullen or whatever his name is. He's
Right.
like, if I don't make the sex robots, someone else is going to make the sex robots. So I might as well make the best sex robots that I can, and make as much money as I can, because we're within that capitalist system. And a lot of times we don't stop and think, well, is this good or bad? Is this normalizing something that's actually very harmful? Is this going to have some, future repercussions that we don't think about? And, there's that Futurama episode in where people start having sex with robots and all of civilization crumbles, right? Because if you could have sex with a robot, why would you ever want to have sex with a person? And obviously it's great for a comedy, cartoon show, but that's not how it shakes out in the real world.
Right. Yeah. Although it's on the plus side in terms of technology, there was a Simpsons episode where all the televisions went dark, or I think they all started broadcasting like, fluffy, happy stuff with no violence, and all the kids turned off their TVs and went outside, which would be nice if it really went that way. But like with the whole sex robot thing, I mean, to me, it brings up a lot of stuff, which I guess I find myself thinking about frequently, like the whole like incel phenomenon, and the I mean, there have been, you know, and I don't know what that is all about, and nor do I pretend to fully understand it or anything, but it's something like. I remember a biologist telling me a statistic that really stuck with me. She was talking about different animals and in humans, and how much sex different humans have in different situations, and breaking it down by gender. And she was saying that basically the average British woman has something like 6 sexual partners in their lives, and the average British man also has 6 sexual partners in their lives. But the statistics are really not are really misleading, because and now I can't remember the difference between average and median. I think that's very important in this in what I'm about to say, and maybe you know the difference. But basically, with women, it tends towards the overwhelming majority of women have something closer to 6 relationships in their lives, whereas with men, it's much more like there's some men who are having hundreds, and other men, a whole lot of men who have like none or maybe one. And then in the middle, the number of men who actually have 6 is a far smaller actual number. Like, and I explained that really badly, but I think well enough that it makes some sense. And I don't know if you got any thoughts on that in terms of the sex doll question.
Yeah. So there's the incel question, which is sort of related to the sex doll question, right? Whenever I
Somehow,
try to think the internet as a real place, I imagine someone lifting a rock up off the ground, and there's just like all these, centipedes and insects that kind of scatter, right? That's sort of what the internet is like if it were imagined as a place. And so
very good.
You've got this incel culture that is in a lot of ways it is, and I talked about this with Warhammer 40K, right? And it's not for any Warhammer 40K fans out there, like.
And Warhammer 40K, for all the viewers who are like over the age of 40, like me, who don't have any idea what this is, like this is a very, very popular first-person shooter video game. Is that an accurate description? Or
it is actually its most common form is a tabletop game. So it's these little miniatures.
Oh.
Space Marine soldiers that you paint, and you have like a little fake war. It's like it's almost like a really
more like Dungeons and Dragons sort of origins.
Yeah, future Dungeons and Dragons, but as a tabletop battle game, sort of like nerdy chess, with lots of rules and lots of dice rolling.
And then it became a video game too?
It's also now, well, it's like a whole media sensation. It's a video game series. It's got movies. It's got over 300 novels that are set.
What? 300 novels. So there's obviously multiple writers writing in this Warhammer universe kind of thing?
I guarantee you, if you go to your local used bookstore and you look at the sci-fi section, you will find a bunch of these Warhammer books just right there, ready to go. And there are a lot of the fans of the game, really of the genre, whatever you want to call it, are, just like your standard run-of-the-mill white collar, blue collar, mostly white guys who are kind of nerdy, right? And all of them have girlfriends and friends, and this is just sort of like a fun thing they do, just like someone would play D&D, or someone would be really into Star Trek or something. But then you have this other slice of this particular game, where it's very insulated, almost in the same way that like the Catholic Church is insulated, right? Where you have this core group of men who are deciding a lot of the main decisions in terms of the lore, and they are self-supporting each other. And there's this idea where women have become sort of this other, kind of like an alien other. And in that sense, it creates this really unhealthy balance in their relationships with women. And then sometimes in some of those men that manifests as this incel behavior, and there's this like inability to connect with women, which then out of frustration, some men go to the sex robot as an alternative. And in that sense, sex robots I think are really unhealthy because they are really like a crutch, right? That a man who should be working on improving himself, right, and working on talking with people and getting more empathy and emotional intelligence. And instead, I'm just gonna do what I want and go on the internet and go and bang my rubber, robot in my bedroom, or whatever. And that's you got to think that's not an enlightened way to live. So.
What about the argument that and I have no idea how much water it holds in terms of like whether it plays out this way, but the argument that some of the guys with their sex dolls would be doing terrible things to actual human women if they weren't busy with their sex dolls.
Yeah, that is a very like we just stepped into like the danger zone with that question. Like if there was a quicksand warning to this conversation, we have entered the quicksand, David.
Right.
Because there's a lot of evidence flying back and forth. And I'm a scholar of literature, and I do say it like that because I'm
very English of you.
They require me to say it like that. But in terms of like hard science people, the sociologists and the researchers and the psychologists, there's lots of evidence out there that says, well, this is very unhealthy. It actually normalizes violence against women. Really, when you have sex with a robot, I mean, how different is that than having sex with someone who's unconscious or someone who's even like dead? Is there like a certain necrophilia element to it? And yet there is another, side that says, well, actually, you can use this as a form of therapy, and it can like help some people sort of recover from their rape fantasies or whatever. And there's lots of ammunition flying in both directions. So I just fortunately deal with the literature and the fantastical side of it, because the real world stuff is very messy, very sticky,
isn't it? Yeah.
Make a gross joke.
It's so much easier to explore ideas than to like try to reach concrete conclusions about them, isn't it?
Yeah, I know there's been some success, particularly in the virtual reality world. It started with some researchers saying, "Hey, we've got these people with phobias, like you have arachnophobia or something, right? So we're going to put this VR headset on you, and we're going to put you in a room with small spiders, and then bigger spiders, and then bigger spiders, and we're going to slowly cure your arachnophobia, through this sort of process of making you experience it digitally, right?" And I think there have been some studies done, and I'm sorry I can't quote them, where it was done in a similar way, but with, well, this is what it's like to be catcalled, right? Oh, and this is what it's like to have someone insult you based on your body. And if you take someone who is in some anger management training, or who is like having problems, connecting with someone else, and you make them experience it through their eyes, through virtual reality, that can be used to sort of build empathy. So I think that's more promising to me, the VR aspect, than the actual physical tactile robot aspect. So.
Well, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense that you could use VR in a way to build empathy in the ways that you're describing, but then that a sex doll would actually probably tend to have the opposite effect in terms of like creating an environment and what kind of emotional responses in the male user of the sex doll is going to be inspired by this inanimate object that you're using. Obviously, that would tend to draw out not anti-empathetic, whatever that term is, responses.
Yeah, I know there was like a bad incident at a robotics convention where there was like a female robot who was like sort of abused by like some of the male attendees, and it's like, no man, like you can tell just right there in that incident.
Yeah.
Weird. This is not moving in the right direction. No, there's something about sometimes that disconnect, and that's that same getting back to video games, right? Well, what I'm doing is not real. And then when you say, well, what I'm doing is not real, even though it's a real robot, it's like, okay, well, obviously the digital video game thing was less real than the physically animate thing. So the general consensus, is that you should be kind to your robots, or else we're all going to end up like that Black Mirror Metalhead episode with the little dogs coming after us.
Yeah, and I did see a couple episodes of Black Mirror, and it was very good and just too real and too disturbing for me to enjoy. So I just couldn't keep on going with it. That as you say as you write about the near future science fiction. I mean, that stuff can be. I don't think you said this necessarily, but it can be some of the most disturbing stuff because it's so close to reality, except just a little bit further ahead, and yeah, that's. And then in terms of the, when you talk about virtual reality and the way that it can shape in our emotional responses, of course, as a fellow, I guess we call ourselves creators of content these days, but as another content creator, I think I completely would have to agree with that because that's exactly what you and I both do as writers. Like, I mean, when you're writing that piece that you wrote in London Reader that I was just reading this morning, I mean, it was reminding me a bit of the experience I had watching that movie about Johnny Rotten that came out in the '80s about the Sex Pistols. It was I just felt like I was seriously messed up on hard drugs by the end of.
Well, thank you.
I mean.
Yeah, I like to think of myself more as a manufacturer of hallucinations rather than. So I'm glad you had a good trip then. Okay,
It wasn't a really good trip, but it definitely was like, yeah, I was. I mean, yeah, it's yeah. I mean, you of course you're taking people somewhere, right? You're writing in such a way that you are transporting people somewhere, and if it works, and if they stick with you and actually read what you're writing, and of course you write in such a way that the tendency is to want to keep reading, and that's and by the end of it, you have ideally you've transported people somewhere, and you've really taken them somewhere else, and that's, I mean, also just looking at your out of date website, that's also clearly your intention as a writer. I mean, it's an intentional thing. You're trying to take people places, and can you talk about that?
yeah, this is why I've tried to write what you would call quote unquote literary fiction, right? Oh, I'm going to write literature, and I'm going to send it out to these literature magazines and everything. First of all, if you have to pay a fee to submit your writing, then fuck them. Like, you shouldn't have to do that. The money's flowing in the wrong direction. So I very quickly realized that I did not want to be a writer of literary fiction. And science fiction was so much more appealing because, there's already so much reality. Like, we're surrounded by it. It's everywhere. And yet people still want to write about it. And for me, that's not interesting at all. I want to journey off into different dimensions, and I want to go in outer space, and I want to go into a different dimension in outer space, right? Oh, and now we're going to do, a fractal based visual drug in outer space in the center of a neutron star. And okay, now we're really starting to get somewhere that's kind of fun, right? For me, it's a matter of how many layers of obfuscation can I pile upon my reader until they finally collapse and they realize that they're sitting in a chair, and they are hungry and they have to blow their nose. Like, oh, then I've gone too far, right? I'm trying to draw my reader in as much as possible while also still realizing that, well, they're reading a story and it's just words on a page, and there's sort of limit to how much I can get my hallucination that's in my brain connected to your hallucination in your brain through words. And unfortunately, dang it, there's a limiting factor there. We can't get, we can't make it a purely imagination-based process yet.
Yeah, right. I guess there's always that that limiting factor in any form of communication, in that we are not actually taking people in space and time to the place that we're writing about, which may or may not actually exist anywhere in space or time. And so it's just always that sort of there's something removed in the process, because it's just communication after all, rather than actual transportation or something like that, or actually putting somebody in somebody else's shoes. But I don't know how much closer you can get to putting somebody in somebody else's shoes than immersing someone in a whole novel about that, about being in somebody else's shoes.
Yeah, I think the novel is really. You say I've also got Peter's book on order, so I'm like looking forward to reading it. But a lot of my favorite writers I've noticed have their work grounded really in that same empathy. Like, can I connect to this character? And if so, can I experience the world through their lens? And then you get multiple characters involved, and okay, that's trickier because now we've got multiple POVs that we have to deal with. And some writers can pull it off in a way that I'm just right there with them. And I always recommend, if you haven't read it, The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch by Philip K. Dick. I read that book like 6 or 7 times, and I keep going back to it and reading it again because I just really get into that book. I'm there with all the characters, and I'm experiencing what they're experiencing, and what they're experiencing is, they're high on a drug that makes them experience what it's like to be God, and that's not necessarily a good thing. And I love the concept, and I love his execution on that book. So definitely should be good.
Great recommendation. And for folks out there, you are tuned into Fifth Estate Live, which comes to you on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern, and you can also find it at fifthestate.org, archived there for posterity, all the different episodes in video and audio form. And you can also get the winter edition of Fifth Estate, which is the anarchist review of books. And we're talking with Jess Flarity. And Jess, in terms of writing, like from different perspectives, like different points of view, different characters, can you talk about that process? That seems like the most, as a songwriter who's generally writing from one point of view, like it's not my point of view necessarily, but I pick one point of view and write a song from that point of view. And the idea of writing a novel where you have to represent multiple points of view sounds much more complicated. Can you talk about that process of getting into multiple people's heads at the same time?
Yeah, there's all kinds of different ways to tell a story. And for me, the number one rule is keep the reader reading. So whatever you can do to execute on that. And I'm sure it's similar for you as a songwriter, like just keep people listening to the song, right? Don't leave, whatever. That's the number one thing. And so for me, I tend to really like the third person, over the shoulder, camera style of writing, where you've got that point of view that's almost like a movie. And again, to go back to Philip K. Dick, his writing really fits that style, which is why so many of his stories have been made into movies. It's very cinematic. But the story I published in the London Reader was a first-person story. And for me, first person is a little trickier because, well, how do you, the iconic thing that is always the moment for a writer that is you struggle with is what they call the mirror scene, the quote unquote mirror scene. It's like, well, I want to show you who this I is, but I can't just have them explain what they're wearing or whatever. So you have to show them, but if you have them just look at a mirror and like inspect the way they look, well, that's, it's bad writing because that's what everyone does, right? So I had my character feel for their wallet, and they look in their wallet and they see their ID, right? And I'm like, oh, so that was kind of my approach to do a mirror scene in a different enough way that I could show you what the main character looked like without having that super obvious, staring into the reflective pool or something. And, whether or not I succeeded in executing on that, I don't know. As a writer, you never know how well you do. I recently reread that story also, and I was like, I thought it was funny. So I think for me, it's like, as long as it's funny, then things are working.
Whether it was meant to be funny or not, as long as it has some kind of emotional impact, right? That's interesting when you mentioned the mirror scene, because like as a songwriter, there are so many different little things to avoid, pitfalls to avoid, like never rhyme wife, knife, or life. And because there's really not many words that rhyme with life, knife, or wife, other than knife, life, or wife, and it's just avoid that entirely. Like there's a lot of little things like that, but. And obviously there must be with any form of writing, but how would you know to avoid the mirror scene unless you've read a lot of literature? Is that basically, would you say, a necessary precursor to being a good writer?
You know, every writer I know who I admire and love is also just a voracious reader. And there's just it's unfortunate that there's no way of really getting around that. I remember I had a friend who was a filmmaker in college, and he expressively watched almost nothing because he wanted to go in pure, right? So it was like, are you sure you should probably watch some movies if you want to be a filmmaker? And he's like, no, I want to be totally have a fresh lens on it. And so I watched this short movie, and it was like the most like cliche, like cringy. I hope he's not listening right now. The short where it was a guy looking despondently down the road, and then like throwing down his bicycle. It was just like all of the cliche stuff all connected together. And unfortunately, I think writers do the same thing. If they don't read a lot, they think, well, this is a good idea, and this is a good idea. And I've been writing for almost 10 years, and I have one short story published, and I have a couple of flash fiction pieces published. Like the barrier to entry nowadays to be a writer is like 7 years. So for those of you out there listening, and you say, I want to be a writer, and it's your first year, okay, keep going for 6 more years, and maybe you can get there.
Talk about that. What do you mean by that? I think this is also something somebody else on Facebook has been wondering about. Oh, and also Peter Werby was asking, what's the title of that Philip K. Dick book that you last mentioned?
It's called The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch.
Great.
Kind of a long one.
And what's that 6-year process? Talk about that.
Yeah, and so this is, we were talking a little bit earlier about global capitalism and how the flattening of the world via the internet has in some ways really done a lot of great things. It's connected people in ways that we never thought possible. It's enabled all of these different strange publications to come out. In the science fiction world, you've got these little hubs of websites like Strange Horizons, and Clark's World, right? And where all of the best talent is sort of accumulating. But another side of that is that you have this huge barrier to rejection, because these websites, and they're only paying 8 cents a word, David. And guess what they were paying science fiction writers 25 years ago? They were paying them 8 cents a word. Like, it hasn't gone up at all, right?
But the rent has tripled. Yeah.
Exactly. So you have this like, okay, the monetary amount of like income that you earn has not changed, which is like very little. You should never do it for any sort of monetary reasons. But part of the reason why, as a fledgling writer, you want to try to get published in a paid market is because it is some sense of legitimizing agent. Like, I made it, and there are hundreds and hundreds of stories that these places get every month, and they publish 4, right? And so if you can crack into one of those, that you're all of a sudden in that top couple of percentage points. And so you just have to keep sending stories out and getting them rejected. And at this point, I think I have over 50 short stories that I've written, and maybe I could go back and rewrite them. But there's sort of like little crystal sculptures at this point. It's like, oh, I really like that stuff. If I go back and try to fix it, and I'm like, no, I don't want to fix it. But obviously it's like wrong, right? This is my, like if you look at a visual artist, someone even as famous as like, Dali or Van Gogh, and they have these sketchbooks that are just filled and filled and filled with, what is now considered to be worth something because, they're famous, but everyone has to have that trunk or that junk book. And so I've got several novels and over 50 stories just sitting in that trunk. And, there was my sketching that I needed to do before I finally could be good enough to get something out there. And it's a long road.
It's such sound advice that you are sharing with everybody. I hope people realize it's all very real. And I mean, in every art form, and I think, you'll have people who are coming up to artists, writers, musicians, whatever, saying, "Oh, you're just brilliant. You're so talented. You're amazing." Whatever they're saying, and they never. It's always there's some kind of an assumption, I think, based on our based on the industry, really, the industries that like to create this kind of mythology that it is all about sort of inherent brilliance, rather than people who've been working and working and working to develop their craft for a very long time. But
Yeah.
is that, would you say, so much of it is it's mythology that we're fed about this, that's not accurate?
Yeah, there's that line. It took them 20 years to be an overnight sensation, right?
Right,
Yeah, and
right, yeah,
that is unfortunately another product of this. And I don't even know if it's not even capitalism to blame. There's this really interesting sociologist named Zygmunt Bauman who has got this concept he calls liquid modernity, and we live now in liquid modernity, as evidenced by my ability to order from Grubhub and have the restaurant delivered right to me, right? Or I go on the Amazon and I have my products delivered the very next day. And because we have everything at our fingertips like this, I think it makes this illusion that, well, if I can get a product delivered to me near instantaneously, then I should be able to achieve my goal of being a successful musician or a successful artist as instantaneously. And that is just a very laughable illusion that you're going to have to shatter.
And then for those who do get good at their craft, whatever that may be, then there's the reality of the trying to survive in some form in this, particularly in this society, in the United States, and the sort of more free market capitalist world where there's no subsidies for artists and that sort of thing. I mean, or very little. What about the survival aspect, and what why? I mean, those websites that are publishing fiction, do they even have somebody running the website who is making a living running that website? I mean, it just seems like so many of independent art and music and writing. I mean, the industries have just been collapsing. I mean, I know it seems like basically all the anarchist authors in the world are publishing on PM Press nowadays because there's nowhere else that they would publish anywhere anyway if they were writing nonfiction. So it's just these industries have collapsed, and so what is it? But I mean, obviously, they still exist in some form, but in a very, like, the music industry is about 20% the size of what it was 20 years ago in terms of economics, right? Like in terms of the entire thing, independent, corporate, everything. It's all compressed, because of the modern economy and the tech companies and everything else. And what talk about that a bit. It's not a particular question, but just trying to be a writer and getting published in this period of constantly collapsing industries and constantly changing technologies.
Yeah, it was a very strange time to be a writer. One of my other former mentors, Nancy Holder, talks about 2008, and there was a day in publication that was called like Publications Black Friday, because all of a sudden the ebooks had exploded and local bookshops were getting crushed by Amazon, and everything was spiraling in free fall. And so after that 2008, Friday, everything had to adapt, and all of a sudden the entire way that the industry was run changed overnight. It used to be that you got a book deal and you got in advance of, maybe even like $5,000 or $10,000, enough that you could survive and like quit your day job and really be a writer. And then you would get 17%, however, which is like such a small, sad amount, right? Well, I'm only getting 17% of every copy of my book that's sold. But even that method is no longer sustainable. I mean, you hear news stories about X and Y. Well, this person sold their novel for 6 figures or even like 7 figures, and those are your lottery 1 in a million events. Like, you don't use those for any basis of anything, because the way the market is now is, if you can find someone who is willing to stand by your work and put it out there, take what you can get and don't quit your day job.
And the in a book I read recently, which I thought had a whole lot of great points, called "The Death of the Artist" by Bill Deresiewicz, he was saying that with a lot of writers, that they're basically just hoping that whatever they write might potentially get turned into a TV screenplay. I mean, that's kind of like from an economic standpoint, the only sort of the, I think he broke his book down into like 13 different sectors of the arts, and they're all basically hemorrhaging financially except for TV, which is doing very well, although the average worker in television gets paid about 50% of what they used to get paid. There's a lot of programming being created and a lot of work in whether you're writing or acting or directing or any number of other whatever's involved. I guess there's a lot of that going on. Is that when you and other folks are writing, is that basically at the top of their head? Oftentimes they're like, okay, will this make a good screenplay?
I know some people who are always they've got like one foot right in the film world, and another writer I really admire, James Patrick Kelly, said, if you want to get your story or your book turned into a screenplay, you might as well stand out in the front yard and expect to get hit by a meteor. Because that's about as likely as it's going to be. And whenever I imagine sending something in, if I like turned my story, which I think would make kind of a cool little short movie, if I turned it into a screenplay and tried to send it to someone in Hollywood, I just imagine there being like an entire room where they open the door to the room and then just like screenplays pour out all over the floor, and they take my screenplay and they throw it in there, and then they like close the door and they can't even close it because there's so many.
Yeah, I mean, it wouldn't be something. I would imagine that it's not something you'd necessarily go directly like with, right? You'd be doing it indirectly. That would, I assume, be the strategy. Would be you publish something somewhere, and then somebody says, "Oh, this was a good writer," and then they mention it to somebody in Hollywood, and right? I mean, it would be rather than the direct, I don't know, sending the screenplay in. But
yeah,
I don't know how these things work.
Yeah, this is the only other real Hollywoodism that I know of. And that is, if you're in the publishing industry, what you hear as a writer is no, 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 no. Yes. Like you just get tons and tons of rejections, and then finally something will break through. But in the Hollywood sphere, you hear yes, 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 no. And that's just a very...
What does that mean? Why is that? What do you mean?
Well, that means like, oh yeah, the movie, yeah, it's coming, it's on the way. Oh, it's going to be, oh yeah, this is going to be great. Oh, we're working on this, and it's called when you get something that's like optioned. So let's say I sold, my story got optioned to be turned into a TV show. It enters a phase known as development hell, and there's so many awesome things get stuck in development hell. One of my favorite Isaac Asimov stories is called The End of Eternity, and it's it's a little hokey by today's standards, but I think it's just a really smartly written time travel story. And I always thought it's so cinematic, it would make the perfect hour-and-a-half movie. And I was like, why hasn't this ever been made into a movie? And I did some research on it, and sure enough, it's been stuck in development hell for 40 years. Someone picks it up and wants to direct, and then it's sloughed off. I mean, making a movie is a huge production that requires tens and hundreds of people. So that's why I like to write, because I can do everything all by myself. Only one person is required.
Yeah, that's true, right? Only one person is required, but it's such a time-consuming process writing a novel as opposed to writing a poem or a song. And I wonder what drew you in the direction of writing such relatively long form. I mean, because like for somebody like, I don't know, not a lot of people, I think we think about writing novels and we don't do it. We think about it for our whole lives, and maybe we write one sometime before we die. Maybe, usually not. but you've been working on writing novels since you were quite young. And what led you in that direction, as opposed to other forms of communication?
The novel, I think, is very unique because you can tell a story that really affects people and changes them and makes them look at the world in an entirely different way. And I'm sure you've put together albums before, right? Where it's like, okay, well, I have one song, and now I need another song that plays off of that song, and now I have another song that plays off of that song. And so eventually, by the time you've got the entire album. The whole album sort of tells a story, right? And a novel is that same sense. It's like listening to an entire album. The entire album told one single story, except that even more than I think songs you have a little bit of like, there's some shifting you can do, and there's some jumping you can do, and people will still kind of go with you. But in a novel, and I've told people this, if you want to switch from short stories to novels, imagine writing one short story. Now you've got to write 20 short stories, and they all have to interlink together. And it's a very, very complex process. And if you can pull it off, like, kudos to you, because you can really change the way people look at the world. Where, short stories, how many short stories have really changed the way you think about something? It's like somebody yelling at you as they drive by in a car. Maybe you sort of heard what they had to say, but
a novel, it's much more like thorough than a short story in terms of the perspective you can bring about.
Yeah. I love that we've shifted. I'm like, oh, we don't have to talk about sex robots the whole time. Thank God.
I don't know. I guess we could. I mean, I could probably stick to the if we were told you have to talk about sex robots for the entire hour. I think that we could manage it.
Like, why am I hearing about this guy talking about art? Get back to this sex robots.
I did kind of say in my little introduction that we would be talking about sex, drugs, video games, and we may be and religion as well. We haven't talked much about religion or drugs, but it's okay, I think. But
there is. I don't know if you've heard of. There's this cult called Unicron. Have you heard about these people?
Oh no, tell us about it.
Oh,
what's this?
Because this connects right to the sex robot thing again.
Unicron, like unicorn, but with two letters reversed.
Yeah, it is an internet. Again, one of these internet phenomenons. You can look it up later. It's an internet cult, and they said they wanted to create a sex robot brothel. However, and here's the twist that I liked from them, that you would not be allowed to have sex with the sex robot until you had to do this series of wooing of the robot. So you had to talk to the robot, and you had to write the robot a poem or something. I don't know. And the Unicron people said, well, we're going to train empathy in the people with sex robots, because there are other places in the world that do sex robot brothels. And how is that different than a regular brothel? Well, it's not very different at all, right? But Unicron was like, no, we're going to make people empathize with the sex robot, which I don't know if that is good or bad, but I give them kudos for actually trying to do something. And that was a few years ago, and I checked, and I don't think the sex robot thing, was going very well for them. But a very interesting website to entertain yourself with sometime.
It just seems like in terms of the marketing sex robot brothels, it seems problematic in terms of the availability of actual human sex workers. I don't know how many people are going to want to. It would be a certain kind of person who maybe doesn't want to, or just looking for different experiences, or maybe feels it's immoral to hire a human sex worker, but that the robot thing is ethically okay. And I wonder, but that would be a pretty thin slice, I imagine, of people to be marketing your sex robot brothel to. And so maybe they weren't marketing it to the right slice. It's a lot of good marketing involved with anything, right? Yeah. With trying to get any endeavor like that off the ground, whatever it may be.
Yeah, no, and it's just I just don't. I really feel for the person whose job is sex robot custodian, right? I'm the person who has to clean the sex robots after they're done. That's not a job that any human should have to have.
We definitely need the $15.
If you own a sex robot, this is like pulling yourself up from your own bootstraps.
You should clean your sex robot. Yeah.
Yeah, you have to clean it yourself as a minimum.
Another thing that actually reminds me of when I think about writing as well as incel and sex robots, to me that there's a lot of relationship here, because one of the weird things I've always thought about being an artist of any kind is that if you're good at what you do, as far as I can tell, without exception, although maybe there are exceptions, but as far as I know, if you're good at what you're doing, you're spending most of your time alone. And like if you're a writer or a songwriter or a painter or any number of other artists, I'm sure there must be exceptions. Like maybe in television, you're around people all the time. But if you're like a content creator, if you're writing screenplays, novels, songs, poems, or making paintings or any number of other things, if you're going to get good at it, you're spending probably most of your time alone. And I wonder what I mean. Is that a weird contradiction? Because you're like kind of you're writing about all sorts of social occasions, all sorts of dialogue. I mean, so many novels are mostly dialogue, and yet you're sitting alone creating all that dialogue.
Yeah, there's and that's I tried when I got my MFA. I said, you know what, I'm going to do it, and I'm going to go, and I'm going to be a writer. And I moved from Washington State to Maine, and I had my money saved up, so I didn't have to work, and God, it was way more hard than I thought it was going to be. Because I had been writing 1 or 2 days a week, but then when you sit there and you're just by yourself all week, 5 days in a row, it's just you sitting at your desk writing, and God, that is extremely isolating. I don't know if you've experienced that as a song, writer or musician. Also, when you're in the studio, and you come out, and it's almost like, you're in a fog, or in a haze, especially for me, I'm writing about, being off in outer space. And so it's like, which planet am I on again? Oh, Earth. Damn it. I thought, how did I end up back here on Earth?
Yeah.
And so that's just, unfortunately, part of the process. I mean, I've tried to co-write before, and I have had a lot of fun with it, but at the same time, it's not the same as having everything sort of there with you. And I'm sure that you've had that as a band also. Things change a little bit when you've got the band dynamic, in maybe good and bad ways, but you definitely lose that sense of autonomy.
I've never really successfully figured out how to write with another person, although I've done it and come up with a few good songs out of the processes. But I know that I'm not really tuned into this, and I know it can be done. I think it can be done, but I don't know. And I'm sure that's true with any other kind of creative process. That there's ways it can be a collaborative thing, or done that can be done well or not done well. But what about? I mean, I'm just guessing. Maybe I don't know that for sure, but I'm just guessing that other people know how to do it better than me. That's true of most things. When you're writing, and what's that? Sorry.
There's no right or wrong way for
right.
co-writing. Like some people, they'll write a book and they'll alternate one chapter to the next chapter, and they'll
Subcomandante Marx and that Marcos and that other author. I can't remember his co-writer's name, but that was
I don't remember.
Right, that they did it that way anyway. Yeah. Neither one knowing what was going to be happening in the next chapter, which sounds completely maddening. I was thinking about trying to write with somebody on that kind of basis, and I just thought, I don't even want to try doing that. I mean, that sounds like that sounds horrible. I don't know.
You can end up getting some very unexpected results that way. Another way that people do it is like, I write on it until I'm bored, and then I kick it over to you, and then you write on it until you're bored. And sometimes that is even better.
That sounds interesting.
Yeah. And there are a lot of great husband, wife, or partner writing teams out there. And, that's when you're like, okay, you want to be fused. Okay. No, not only are your bodies fused, but your minds are really going to be fused together as you both build this imaginary world. I think my favorite is Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman, who wrote this really cool series in the 80s called The Deathgate Cycle. And it doesn't read like two people wrote it. I mean, it reads like one person wrote it. And it's such a cool science fantasy story. So another one to check out sometime.
Oh, wonderful. I wonder what, another thing, other than spending so much time alone writing as a writer, the other thing that occurs to me, having to the extent that I've engaged in novel writing, which is just enough to have some thoughts on the subject, which is like, you create all these characters, and then if you don't publish the novel, and if the novel doesn't have at least a fairly significant readership, then basically you've created this world and you're alone with it and nobody else. And you know all these characters intimately and nobody else knows them. And what's that like? I find it's very strange.
Yeah, I always like to tell the story of Glaucus. And Glaucus was a Welsh man who came to a writing group I was hosting. And, this was like an amateur's, like, I'm breaking my teeth on the industry. I'm going to create a writer's group and welcome strangers from the internet to my writer's group, meetup.com, right? And Glaucus came in and he gave us this first chapter of his fantasy novel he'd written. And, it read like a D&D adventure. Like, a dwarf and a freaking elf meet up in a tavern and they go and out killing goblins. And I was like, okay. So Glaucus, and it was like decently written, right? Like this guy, he knew how to write, this Welsh guy. And he said, I was like, well, this is just like a D&D fantasy. And it's hard to sell a D&D fantasy. You've got to really do something more with it. And he goes, oh, well, I have a couple of these books. And I was like, well, how many of these have you written? He had written 12 books in this series. Like there was the whole Glaucus epic. And I said, well, give us the most recent chapter you read. Don't give us your first chapter. He sent us chapter freaking, 10 of book 12. And David, it was exactly the same as the first chapter. Like this guy had been like in his little imaginary D&D world for 10, 11, 12 books. And I was like, I said, you know what? At some point, you should write for yourself and you should just enjoy that writing. And that's it. He built, his own little world, and he was either the god of that world or just an observer of that world, or he just liked being in that world. And I don't want to be the person to be like, you'll never sell this and you're a terrible writer. Like, I'm not going to tell him that. Like, oh, you know what? You write this for you, and that's good for you. And so I hope Glaucus is, still off on his adventures today, and enjoying them, I guess.
Because it's good for him, and if it's good for him, then that's fine, right? I mean, but then if you're writing something, then it's when is it like? Is it only really like something like I remember Jim Page, songwriter I greatly admire from Seattle. He would say it's not really culture until it leaves your bedroom, like
Yeah.
or your living room or whatever. Yeah.
That's a great way of looking at it because, you think about people say, well, have you done your 10,000 hours to be a master or whatever it is you're doing? And it's not doing 10,000 hours. It's doing 10,000 hours reflectively, actively trying to improve yourself. And, Glaucus may have done his 10,000 hours, but it was 10,000 hours all in his own little court. He never stopped and got feedback and tried to make it better. And, if his intention was to be, your George R.R. Martin, big fantasy type, then he would have to change something in this process. But if his intention was to just write fun stories that he enjoyed, then, there's nothing else he had to do.
Yeah, right. It's so much about not just putting in the time, but putting in the time in the right way, isn't it? So there's something to be said. There you are at a university again. There's something to be said for instruction and mentorship and that sort of thing, huh?
Yeah, if you can get fully funded for education, I highly recommend it for anyone because you just get to pay. You get paid to learn stuff. Like, wow, I got to read books all day, and I technically got paid for that. That's amazing. So
and you get feedback from people that have valuable feedback, which you might not want to seek out if you didn't have to seek it out in the process of getting your education, right? Because it can be quite painful.
Oh yeah, like at a certain point in your academic or career, if you're going to get your MFA as a creative person, you're going to feel like your soul is being dissected, and it's a very painful process. But at the same time, it's like, you know what? I needed that to be dissected in order to improve, and so you have to just accept it and go with it also.
And to people who may have asked a question online that I didn't get to, I'm sorry. Sometimes I saw them and then I didn't know what it was actually related to. But anyway, what do you feel that Welsh guy was stagnated with his writing? I don't remember what this question is about, but I'm asking you. Do you know what this question is about?
I think we were just talking about the creative process and how to improve and how to get your stuff out there.
Okay, that's what the Welsh guy. Okay, I just missed the Welsh.
I mean, he was caught in a loop, And we get back to that conversation at the beginning of talking about addiction. Um, was he addicted to his own writing and addicted to his own story? I would say yes, he was, and I would hope that he would take some feedback and improve his writing, just like a person who is caught in the cycle of addiction, whether it's to a sex robot or whether it's to a drug, or there's all kinds of healthy/unhealthy addictions you can have. And well, are you doing it just because you enjoy it? And if so, well, do you really enjoy it anymore? Like, what is it you really enjoy? I think those are important questions that we should all ask ourselves, whether or not we're people who are artists or people who have sex with robots.
I love it. That you came full circle with that. That was really neatly done. Jess Flarity, thanks so much for joining me for the hour. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you, David, for having me.
Hope to see you again. And thanks everybody for joining me and Jess Flarity in this discussion for Fifth Estate Live, which comes to you every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern, on Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook, and then gets archived at fifthestate.org and turned into a podcast as well, which you can find if you look for This Week with David Rovix wherever you get your podcasts. And I will be back at the same time tomorrow. Who am I talking to tomorrow? Now I should actually have my calendar up, and I don't. Okay, so I'll tell you tomorrow. And remember, mutual aid will get us through. Trust your neighbors. Don't pay the rent unless you really have to. Bye for now.